Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, with a run-up to COP26 later this month, many organisations are considering, for the first time in many cases, how they can quantify their GHG emissions so they know exactly where they are when it comes to their carbon footprint. Now, if you haven't done this before, don't worry. This podcast is going to share with you all about how you go about it and what your kind of key considerations are when it comes to quantifying your GHG emissions. So here to tell us more about it is our resident carbonologist, David Algar. Welcome back, David.
Hello, thanks for having me on again.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, David. I know that this is quite a confusing area for some organisations because they're scared about the number crunching aspects and wondering what type of data they should be collating. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to demystify a lot of that for us today.
Yep, that's what I'm here for.
Cool. So let's kick off with the very first step then. You know, what is the first step when an organisation's embarking on quantifying their GHG emissions?
So one of the very first steps, and something I've found to be very useful when doing this and when quantifying the emissions, is getting leadership commitment. So this really helps with the quicker decision making and the allocation of roles and responsibilities. So that really helps with data collection later down the line, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then once you've got this leadership commitment, the next step is to start establishing your boundaries. So if you were using traditional ISO terminology, you could almost liken this to the scope.
Yeah, with you. And actually, the last podcast I did was talking about scope and how to define the scope of your ISO management system. So for listeners tuning in, you can go back one episode and find out a little bit more about scoping for other ISO standards. So you mentioned about defining boundaries then. So how do you go about defining your boundaries as an organisation?
So there are two ways you define your boundaries as specified in ISO 14064 Part 1. The first are your organisational boundaries. I personally always think of this as the where when looking at emissions, so essentially where the emissions are coming from within your organisation. So for instance, you'll need to outline which specific facilities are included within the quantification. So it's not quite as simple as just saying everything. You need to, again, specify which sites, offices, buildings, factories, etc. you're including.
Okay, sorry to interject there, David. For those of our listeners that don't know what ISO 14064 is, could you just explain about what that standard is for those that haven't picked up on one of our previous podcasts that we did on that standard?
Of course. So that's the standard we use at Blackmores and many other people use for quantifying greenhouse gas emissions at an organisational level. So it's just one of the more recognised ones in the world.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much.
Oh yeah, so you can define your organisational boundaries via the control approach. So what facilities do you have financial or operational control over? Or the equity share approach. So this is where you account for your portion of emissions and removals from the selected facilities. Going on from your organisational boundaries, the next step is then to look at your reporting boundaries. Again, I personally always think of this as the what is included. This refers to more specific activities and specific sources of the greenhouse gas emissions. Again, I'll just go over this briefly because we've mentioned it on some previous podcasts. But emission sources are split up into three categories, so your three scopes. So scope 1 being your direct emissions from combustion or leaks from systems. Normally it's sources you own. Then you've got your scope 2, which is your indirect emissions from imported energy. And then arguably the more complex one is the scope 3, so this is all your other indirect emissions. So these will be potentially from sources you don't necessarily own or unfortunately have much control over, such as, say, staff commuting or supply chains, or, for instance, emissions coming from products you manufacture and sell to customers. Depending on your organisation, Scope 3 generally will account for somewhere around 60 to 80% of your total emissions. So for most organisations, not all, they do make up the majority. Again, obviously this does vary, but to me it highlights how setting targets for Scope 3 should really be a priority for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, definitely. They're high numbers, aren't they? 60 to 80% of total emissions. Yeah, that's quite significant. So how would you recommend going about collecting all of that data then, David? Where do you begin?
Yes, that's one of the fun parts. So ISO 14064 Part 1 wants you to have primary data, so data you've collected yourself, really. Some of the most common sources of this information you'll need to then go on and quantify the emissions include utilities bills, so for your gas, electricity, water, etc. Expense claims, so again, I'm often going through mileage claims, which are quite useful. And then, for instance, meter readings. So literally opening up the cupboard and having a look at what the meter readings are. What organisation, or some organisations, are doing going forward is sending out surveys to staff, so you can gather information such as commuting habits, which is really, really useful from my perspective, on distance and specific vehicles. Another thing that's quite important at the moment is the mix of home and office working, just to identify who's in the office, X amount of days a week and who's at home. Obviously, not everyone's going to end up completing these surveys, but it is a much more accurate way to gather data than simply guessing. I'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, but in the real world, all the information you need and want isn't always going to be available, or at least it won't be available in the format you wish it was. Businesses generally know how much they're spending and where the money's going and back and forth, but this doesn't always translate to recorded units or distances or volumes in some cases. These, of course, then have to be translated into emissions, which then, going back to what I said about leadership commitment, this is where you really start to see the benefit of having a specific person or group of people dedicating to collecting and managing this data. So, for instance, sending a few emails to get meter readings is, relatively simple for most businesses, not all, unfortunately, but for most. But if you're looking at an international business with multiple sites and varying functions all around the world, it's important to have someone with dedicated time managing this data collection. And of course, going forward, you'll start setting that framework to collect data, over and over, year on year. Make it a bit easier for yourself potentially.
Yeah, so would you say that the first year is the hardest, really, in terms of establishing where you're going to get that data from and doing the number crunching, and then does it get easier after that then, David?
Yes, potentially. I mean, if you've never recorded stuff like this, before, obviously you can't go back in time, which makes your first time you do this your base year. So your base year is the year you compare future emissions against and track reductions against. So these could be absolute, or they could be intensity based, which I believe we touched on in our SECR podcast. So these are, for instance, tons of CO2 per employee or product sold, or square space of a premises. So yeah, obviously you can't go back in time. So if the data's not there, it's not there. But going forward, you can select your first year as your base year.
So if, for example, there was data, going back the last 5 years, say, which would be great, you could still select your base year though, couldn't you? And, are there any recommendations for selecting that base year, David? Because obviously we're in very interesting times right now as a result of COVID, which has significantly affected GHG emissions. We've got a lot of people working from home right now, we've got less travel, etc. So, what would your advice be for, deciding on what that base year is going to be? Would you recommend that that's before COVID, during COVID, or as we're coming out of COVID, almost like post-COVID, if they were looking at 2021 data?
Yes, that is something I've been considering and talking to people about. So I was number crunching for one organisation recently, and by the time I sort of, with the help of a colleague, sort of got to a sort of draft, first version of the emissions, we just thought we might as well go back to 2019 because that showed the trend. And of course 2020 happened and it kind of bucked the trend. Even 2021 isn't continuing as it was normally. So in some cases, yeah, it would be good to set targets based on, 2019 or 18 or, even further back to before COVID, if that's practical for your business. What I have found on that note is sometimes it seems like emissions have gone down because of home working. But then once you account for the home working, the emissions can, in some cases, jump up quite a lot more than you'd expect.
Right, okay. Yeah, interesting. So it's beneficial now more than ever then to have a defined methodology then for actually collating the data and doing the number crunching. So, talking about the number crunching, many people that are embarking on quantifying their GHG emissions get really confused when it comes to this part of, the data quantification. Could you just try and demystify what this number crunching is all about, David, and explain how an organisation can go about doing that?
Yes, this is the fun part. It's a bit like doing an investigation. So basically, at the end of the process, we want to see all our levels of emissions for each of the Kyoto gases and more if relevant. So this will allow us to then see our emissions as tons of CO2 equivalent, which is sort of the most commonly used metric for looking at emissions. So that accounts for each of the gases, global warming potential, and takes that into account. I won't go into too much detail on all of the gases, But I'll mention it's very important to record all of these, as some gases have global warming potentials 200 or 1,000 or 20,000 times stronger than CO2, even higher in some cases. So even a small leak, say from an air conditioning system or a specialized manufacturing system, it can be important. They can add up potentially. So the way we actually calculate emissions is using conversion factors. So we take a metric such as the kilowatt hours of electricity from an office or an area, or miles driven in a specific vehicle, or tons of material used if you're a manufacturing organization or a construction organization, and we multiply this metric by its corresponding conversion factor. So I personally see this as quite lucky in the UK because we have emission factors published every year. So they're published by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, going back every year to I think around 2002, 2003. So they go back quite a way if you did want to go back in time. They're updated each year to account for changes such as the ratio of fossil fuels and renewables in our electricity, for instance, with generally renewables going up each year and accounting for more of the mix, or fuel guidelines. Just mentioned on an international scale, obviously other countries release conversion factors too. The thing with this is you might have to do some conversion of the units, and it may involve potentially using some of the UK ones to help you make an estimate where possible. So like I mentioned earlier, the data you need isn't always going to be available in the ideal format, hence why I mentioned sort of converting units on an international scale. In my experience, for instance, you often have to calculate emission figures for utilities based on financial data. In this instance, you'll need to spend a bit of time on Google identifying rates for specific areas and specific years if you literally don't have anything else to go on. For many businesses, the landlord will bill you as a portion of your service charge and not necessarily give you an indication of the actual usage. But mentioning landlords and facilities management, it's always a good idea to have that good working relationship with them. Not only to collect the data in the first place, but you can work with them to introduce reduction initiatives going forward.
Okay, cool. So in relation to the data that you gather, you've done the number crunching. In many cases, it could be difficult to get accurate data across all different types of energy sources in order to be able to calculate the GHG emissions. Are you allowed to make some estimations and assumptions? Because obviously there are a lot of uncertainties as businesses start to embark on this journey. But I know that they are ultimately doing their best to be as transparent as possible. How do you go about doing that? And is it possible to allow for estimations and assumptions?
Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to throughout this podcast is, you're going to have to make some assumptions as you go. The data won't always be available. Like I said, you can't go back in time. And even if it is available, it might not be in the ideal format, or, parts might be missing. In line with 14064 Part 1, one of the key sort of principles in it is accuracy. So you need to be as accurate as possible. And I'm just using sort of examples from the past few weeks, really, even if this does mean going through individual lines of expenses for flight claims and working out, individual distances, or, based on ticket costs, or coming up with a system to represent your supply chain, or literally, again, going through lines of data to pick out duplicates. Another important aspect of 14064 is the transparency principle. So again, from sort of experience recently, the best way to manage this is simply make your calculations visible. This way they can be, reviewed and sense checked by others. They might not necessarily agree with you in, every instance, hence why you can review them. But it does help you be a bit more transparent if you're open with them. So another key part of it is uncertainty. So for each emission source, you have to assign it a qualitative and quantitative level of uncertainty. For instance, again, just practical examples, expense claims are generally quite accurate, particularly for mileage, as they show, the miles from one location to another. And if you're very lucky, they'll show you a specific vehicle. So for instance, you could say this has an uncertainty level of between 2 and 5%. It's also something that can be easily sense checked with a simple Google map search from location A to B. The other end of the scale calculates emissions from the life cycle of products can generally, for most organizations, have a high degree of uncertainty, as you don't know how a customer is going to use your product, how long it will last, how it will be disposed of, or potentially even if it's used at all. So you could, for instance, assign this a level of uncertainty of 30 to 40%, for instance. But then again, there is the positive outcome of managing all these uncertainties and estimates, is that you're going to, again, have a framework going forward to calculate specific sources for future reporting periods. And this is also going to highlight areas where data collection is lacking. Again, moving forward, you can work on that and set long-term goals to collect the data you're missing in the first few reporting periods.
Yeah, so the quality of that data is only going to improve year on year as you get more experience and you refine the methodology that you're using. And talking about methodology, I just want to remind listeners that we did record a podcast on Carbonology, which is our service offering that takes you on the 7 steps to becoming carbon neutral. And this is the areas that David's talking about today in terms of defining scope and boundaries and calculating and quantifying your GHG emissions are the first couple of steps within that Carbonology process. So yeah, David will be more than happy to speak to our ISO show listeners if they want to get in touch with him. And his contact details will be in the podcast show notes if anybody would like to have a chat with David about that. I hope you don't mind that, David.
No, that's all right.
So just finally then, moving forward, once you've completed that exercise, what's the next step?
So then from all your hard work, you'll be able to see the biggest source of emissions and set targets based on these. Obviously getting a few quick wins on the sort of smaller sources is obviously great, but the biggest emission sources should arguably be the priority areas for reductions for most businesses. Of course, the irony of this is generally the biggest emission sources, so your scope 3s, are the emission sources that businesses generally have the smallest amount of control over, ironically. But there will usually be some action that can be taken to reduce them. It's just a case of planning out your strategy and setting long-term goals if needed to work on these, particularly with, say, supply chains. Quantifying emissions, like you said, Mel, is also one of the first and potentially the most essential step towards achieving carbon neutrality, as you can't get very far without knowing what your emissions are. So again, PAS 2060 is a standard we use here at Blackmores, part of our Carbonology service. So again, as you mentioned, helps businesses go carbon neutral. And another key part of our Carbonology service, and of course PAS 2060, is developing and implementing a carbon reduction plan or carbon footprint management plan, so you can see the reductions over subsequent reporting periods and eventually, work towards achieving carbon neutrality.
Excellent. Thanks very much then, David. I think that's been really helpful for those organisations that are looking at quantifying their GHG emissions. I think especially in the run-up to COP26, businesses are going to be getting prepared to answer some difficult questions about their GHG emissions, and hopefully this gives them a bit of a better insight as to what's involved if COP26 does inspire them to actually look at calculating their GHG emissions and also looking at ways to be able to reduce their emissions and potentially offset their carbon as well, so they can become carbon neutral. So thanks very much, David. Hopefully we'll catch up with you again soon.
Yes, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And thanks very much for all of our ISO show listening in today. I just wanted to let you know that David and I are actually going to be speaking at a webinar, which is focused very much on supporting businesses in the run-up to COP26. So David and I are going to be explaining in a lot more detail about some of the standards that David's mentioned in the podcast today, such as ISO 14064, PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality standard, and also the methods used in order to be able to implement those standards. The date of that webinar is on the 7th of October. So if you go along to our show notes, you'll be able to get access to a link to be able to register for that event. And just finally, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our regular ISO show listeners that tune in every single week. We really do value your input when it comes to your reviews and comments. So please do keep sharing those with us. And also, if you for the other people with a similar interest that would be interested in hearing about what we're talking about on the ISO show, which is all about sharing tips for success and demystifying ISO standards, then please do like and share all the information on various social media channels that you use, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter. And we would love to hear your comments on iTunes reviews or SoundCloud or whichever is your preferred podcast media player. So thanks once again for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to achieve certification to an ISO standard or just need a helping hand with ISO compliance? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com.